Hello friends, welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Before this next dungeon, there is a lot of story stuff and fetch questing to get through, so let's just go ahead and hop into it. Last time, we completed the Temple of Time, meaning there is only one mirror fragment remaining to collect. We also found the Dominion Rod, which is going to be pretty important for the progression towards the next dungeon. However, when we emerge from the temple entrance and back into the present day, Uku will ditch us, and Midna will note that the rod has actually lost its power, rendering it useless. We'll get an indication of where to head next via a letter in the mail from Renato, the shaman of Kakariko Village, who asks to speak to you regarding Ilya's memory. If we head to Telma's bar, we'll also find out that Shad, one of our freedom fighter friends, has also headed to Kakariko to investigate this and that. Thanks, Telma. In the Kakariko Sanctuary, there's a lot going on. Shad will be in the basement investigating this owl statue, stating that there is a connection between it, as well as the other owl statues in Hyrule, and the sky beings known as the Uka. But we'll come back to him later, as even he will hint that we need to sort things out with Ilya and Renato upstairs first. There is a connection here, however. Renato tells us that Shad is doing research on the heavens, and Ilya has some faint memory about someone rescuing her who talked about the Rod of the Heavens. The Goron elder, Gorkoron, believes that if we work our way back and retrace Ilya's steps, we may be able to find a clue to restoring her memory. Renato gives us a letter to bring to Telma, since Telma was caring for Ilya before our escort mission to Kakariko. So back to Telma's bar it is. With the letter delivered and Telma brought up to speed, she recounts for us that before Ilya was in her care, she was brought in by the town doctor. Telma is concerned that the doctor won't open up to us, calling him a crusty old bat, so she gives us an invoice with the doctor's running tab at the bar, which should be an incentive to get him to talk, especially considering it is an astronomical amount. That is too many zeros, dude. This only sort of works, however. Not only does the doctor not have the money to pay his tab, but he is also short on information. He does let it slip, however, that he had a small statue that he actually stole from Ilya and intended to sell. However, he spilled medicine on it, and the stank was apparently so bad that he set it outside to dry and, well, it was stolen. We can use our wolf senses to get a whiff of the medicine and follow the scent trail, which leads us back to Telma's bar. Louise, the cat, will inform us that she actually stole the wooden statue from the doctor who stole it from Ilya, likely meaning to return it to her, but it was stolen again by a pack of stallhounds. So if we head out to Hyrule Field and wait until nightfall, the angry bone dogs will come out to play, we can defeat them, and we'll have the wooden statue, which appears to be a small totem pole adorned with the ever recognizable Sheikah eye. We can show the statue to Ilya, and it does indeed stir some of her memory. She'll recall that she was confined somewhere with the person who gave her the statue, meaning that said person is still in danger, but she doesn't recall more than that. Gorkoron chimes in here saying that he recognizes the statue, which belonged to a tribe that protected the royal family, obviously meaning the Sheikah tribe. They lived in a secret village, the path to which was blocked by a landslide, so he sends Darbus ahead to clear the path for us. We can head to the hidden village entrance, which is just north of Elden Bridge, and find Darbus just as he finishes clearing rocks. He'll advise us that the village is overrun by a band of Bulblins, no more than 20, and that we're enough to defeat them. This leads us into one of the most fun little sections of the game, this intense spaghetti western style hidden village shootout. We'll have to make our way through the village and eliminate all 20 of the Bulblins. You can take them on by any means necessary, but using your bow is really the most efficient way. On top of just being absolutely fun, the music in this section is unreasonably awesome. They didn't have to go so hard on this section, but they did, and it makes for one of the most memorable set pieces in the game. My only complaint here is that I wish this section was a bit longer. There's only 20 baddies, and nearly half of them can be sniped before even setting foot through the village gate. I just get so into the vibe of this scenario, and then it's over so fast. Ah well. Once they're all defeated, a little old lady will peer out from the house at the end of the village. Her name is Impaz, likely a descendant from Impa, and she is the last resident of the village, which is in fact Old Kakariko, meant to be the same one from Ocarina of Time. There's even a sign here that says "Welcome to Old Kakariko," though there is a spelling error. Oops. She confirms that Ilia was imprisoned in the village here with her, and that she helped her escape. Impaz herself can't leave by royal decree, more on that soon, but Ilia left behind a charm, which Impaz now gives to us. Alright, now we can bring that charm back to Ilia, and her memories will come flooding back to her as she recalls being childhood friends with us. Turns out this charm was actually meant to be a gift to Link, a horse call, so that we can summon good old Jebby here anytime we want. Now with her memory restored, Ilia is able to elaborate a bit on the Rod of the Heavens thing, saying that it was actually about the messenger to the heavens who held the rod, and that Impaz has been waiting for said messenger to appear as it has been prophesied by her people. And Shad still has no freaking clue about anything that's going on. Poor Shad. So it's back to the hidden village we go. Just as a side note, on our return trip, we can also find some extra goodies. There's a Poe here, as well as a mini game we can play with all of these cats, which ends with a chicken giving us a piece of heart. And perhaps most importantly, the final Howling Stone so that we can learn the last hidden skill from the Hero's Shade. Alright, so we can show Impaz the Dominion Rod, and she'll realize that Link is in fact the messenger to the heavens. Generations of Sheikah have guarded a book that is to be given to the messenger, the Sky Book, an ancient book written in the Sky language. However, a crucial word is missing from the book, so yeah, there's still more. We can show the book to Shad, who attempts to cast a spell from the book, which he hopes will break the seal on the owl statue in the sanctuary basement, but it seems to do nothing. He decides that he'll try the spell out on the other owl statues around Hyrule, and even marks their locations on our map. However, the spell didn't do nothing after all. It actually restores power to the Dominion Rod. Now we'll need to visit all of those statues that Shad marked on the map, and use the Dominion Rod to move them and recover these sky characters, which fills out the missing word in the Sky Book. Does this sound convoluted? Yes, well that's because it is. Just go with it. More so than perhaps any other section of the game, maybe aside from goat herding in the intro, this back and forth fetch questing all over the place feels like padding. Were they worried this game was going to be too short or something? Because it's already not that short of a game. But alright, we'll visit all the owl statues, all of which have a secondary puzzle that rewards us with cash, which we'll actually need, and even a couple pieces of heart. And after all of that, we can return to the sanctuary basement and show Shad the newly completed Sky Book, which actually does remove the seal on the statue here. We can use the Dominion Rod to move said statue, revealing a hidden chamber which contains a huge cannon. There's not much we can do with it here, so we'll need Midna to warp it out for us. I always find it kind of funny how she won't warp it while Shad is watching, so we basically have to tell him to bugger off. Poor Shad. Though he at least does give us a hint that the cannon is in need of repairs. So where can we take it to get it fixed? Back to Lake Hylia to see our resident cannon expert fire. He'll fix it for 300 rupees, and after a quick montage, we'll have ourselves a working sky cannon. Whew. Was that a lot? Yes, maybe too much in fact. But with all of that done and the cannon fixed, we can use it to launch ourselves and Uku, who follows us once again, to the sky, which is exactly how we reach the dungeon.
You still wrong me.
Oh boy, here we go. Of all the dungeons in this game, this is the one that is probably most often at the center of theories. But before we jump into theory territory, let's have a good look at this place. City in the Sky is easily the longest dungeon in the game. While the first 3 dungeons of Twilight Princess laid out the groundwork for the various dungeon progression structures, balancing interconnectivity, linearity, and openness, the next 3 dungeons essentially doubled down on and refined those ideas. This dungeon, on the other hand, feels like something of a culmination of those ideas. All of these concepts come together to create a lengthy dungeon that is, in broad strokes, large, sprawling, and interconnected, with a central area and branching paths, but when looking at the individual sections of the dungeon, has lengthy obstacle courses and long linear routes. So in a way, it uses those linear set pieces as components in a larger interconnected dungeon. If that sounds contradictory or confusing, that's because it kind of is. There's a lot going on with this place. Even looking at the layout, the dungeon is almost like a handful of dungeons in one, with each of these city pods being their own segmented section. These disjointed segments are connected by bridges or gaps that we can hookshot across, but otherwise they don't impact each other too much, aside from stashing keys and items in different sections from where they're used. One advantage to this segmented structure is that the dungeon has a wonderful sense of scale. You can see other far off pods and sections of the dungeon aside from the one you're in, and the various large outdoor spaces and courtyards make the whole place feel a lot less claustrophobic than prior dungeons. Being able to see from one end of the dungeon to the other and having these large gaps between pods makes the whole place feel fantastical and larger than life, and the dungeon uses this sense of scale effectively by having the interesting landmarks of the dungeon visible, like these egg-shaped spires and even the dungeon boss being in view at almost all times. That being Argarok, a big old dragon who spends the whole time swooping around the northernmost pod where the boss fight will take place. In a way, this calls to mind the moon of Majora's Mask, or even Calamity Ganon from Breath of the Wild, being a large looming threat hanging over us at all times, being our end goal, and acting as a constant reminder of the stakes. Though Argarok here is definitely that concept on a smaller scale, it still is done effectively and helps this boss feel like an integrated part of the dungeon rather than just an arbitrarily large monster that's in a big room for some reason. A particularly fascinating detail is that this city in the sky is the hometown of the Uka, the race of sky beings that Uku here is a member of. The Uka, and by extension this city in the sky, are all inspired by or even directly based off of this painting by M.C. Escher called Another World. The resemblance here between these bird people and the zany, surreal art isn't exactly hard to see. Heck, the Uka even walk on the walls here somehow, playing into the spatial and dimensional surrealism of this artwork. It almost makes me wish we had that wall and ceiling walking mechanic from Goron Mines incorporated into this dungeon as well, just to play into that spatial surrealism even more, but oh well. This dungeon still makes fantastic use of Link's inventory. There are puzzles here to incorporate a lot of our items, like the boomerang, iron boots, bow, and even the spinner gets put to use. Though it does feel like a huge missed opportunity, in my opinion, that the Dominion Rod is never used in the dungeon. It's clearly important since Uku herself went to great lengths to find it, and then we had to go through a huge lengthy fetch quest to restore its power, but then it isn't integrated into this dungeon whatsoever. That said, the actual dungeon item that we find here is so fun, and in terms of gameplay, it more than makes up for this. The architecture here is pretty interesting. The dungeon has an industrial-like feeling with these large grates, propellers, and very artificial geometry. The Goron Mines also felt very industrial, but City in the Sky looks and feels very sanitary in comparison. This place is almost entirely man-made, or bird bird made, compared to the Goron Mines, which was a quarry dug into a mountainside. And the few sections with any nature here, like these trees and sections of grass, all feel deliberately placed like courtyards or public gardens. City in the Sky is also very detailed in its architecture. The Art Deco industrial fusion style with these simple geometrical shapes that are covered in what looks like vents feels like a deliberately stark contrast to the more gothic or baroque style of the previous dungeon, and the very high fantasy medieval architecture of Hyrule below. This is not to say that the place is devoid of any architectural flair. There's still a fair amount of ornate detail like these golden swirl patterns, but that feels far less on the forefront of this place's visual identity. Instead, most of the floors and walls are made up of simple blocks and tiles. These floor tiles still have some symbolism present, however, like these ones that look like they depict fans, and the rupee shapes along many of the others, but overall the place has probably the most minimalist look of any of the dungeons so far. A neat detail is that the doors of the dungeon, which so far in the game have often featured a symbol with significance to the dungeon itself, share their design with the ancient sky book. This symbol at the center of it is something of a head scratcher for me. It also appears on the dungeon map screen. At first, I thought it resembled a modified Sheikah symbol, and then I thought maybe it just kind of resembles the head of a young Uka, who are literally just floating heads. But the more I look at it, the less this symbol makes sense to me. It's not really a match for any of the sky characters that we find around Hyrule for the sky book, but the symbol is on the front of the book as well as the base of the statues where we find said characters, so it could be a part of the skybook alphabet, or maybe more generally just a character or emblem to represent the sky beings as a whole, not unlike how the Zoras, Gorons, and other races of Hyrule all have their own crests. Speaking of symbols, this little icon shows up here and there as well. I personally believe that this is a symbol to represent the Dominion Rod. The same symbol was also dotted around the Temple of Time where the rod was kept, as well as being present on the statues that we can interact with using the rod. Of course, this does make sense. As previously mentioned, this is a significant relic for the Sky People. Impaz tells us that the Dominion Rod was gifted to the Hylian royal family by the Uka, and we know the Sky Beings left the Sky Book with the Sheikah to be given to the royal messenger. Shad also tells us a bit more history about the Uka, which he learned from studying ancient texts, particularly about them being a race with close ties to the gods. But before we get into the idea of the Uka having created the Hylian people, as he states, I'm just gonna pump the brakes on that idea. This is actually an error, a mistranslation in the English text. In the original Japanese version of Twilight Princess, he tells us that the Uka had a hand in creating the land of Hyrule, and after the birth of the Hylians, the Uka departed from the surface and created a new capital for themselves to live in, that being the City in the Sky. Now, if this sounds contradictory to the origin story that we see play out in Skyward Sword, that could be chalked up to legends being diluted or misunderstood over time. Technically, the Sky Loftians would be a group of sky dwellers, and maybe Shad mixed these things up. But there is still a way that this could work out in terms of lore. Of course, we're stepping back into theory territory, so buckle up. And big special thanks goes to my friend Lorulian Historian, the legend himself, for consultation on this section. We know that the Kingdom of Hyrule was officially founded in political terms after the end of Skyward Sword, when that game's Link and Zelda decided to remain on the surface of the world rather than return to their home in Skyloft. So when Shad talks about the Uka helping create the Kingdom of Hyrule, it could be that they dwelled on the surface of the world before it came to be known as Hyrule itself. Thanks to Skyward Sword's time travel shenanigans, we know that back then it was called Hylia's realm. The Japanese text uses an interesting word for this creation of the Hylian people, Tenju, which I could be pronouncing wrong, which could mean a literal creation, but just as likely means a figurative birth or formation. It's worth noting that the humanoids that we know as Hylians never refer to themselves as Hylians before the foundation of Hyrule. Hyrule as a kingdom. In the era of Skyward Sword, they simply call themselves humans. So when Shad talks about the birth of the Hylian people, it could mean the foundation of these people as Hylians living in Hyrule. That would mean at some point here that the Uka ascended to the city in the sky to establish their capital. This means for me that any theories that the Uka evolved from the people who remained on Skyloft are off the table in my opinion, because what Shad tells us is that these people existed as a separate race from the Hylians already by this point. In fact, these sky beings share a lot more in common with another race of cloud-top dwellers, that being the Wind Tribe of the Minish Cap. Even as early in the Zelda timeline as Minish Cap, signs of their civilization are ancient, predating the rather recently founded kingdom of Hyrule. Their origin stories are also almost identical, both being surface dwellers who left the ground to live in the sky, in dwellings of their own making, rather than the story of the Skyloftians who were placed on an outcropping of land by the goddess Hylia and sent skyward by her. Both the Uka and the Wind Tribe left to the surface of their own volition by using their own powers to raise their homes into the sky. Moreover, that word, the surface, is always used to describe the land before it was called Hyrule, and it's exactly the term that the Wind Tribe uses as well as the term used by pretty much everybody in the era of Skyward Sword. But there's some more connections between the surface and city in the sky, specifically in the Lanayru Desert of Skyward Sword. In that game, after overcoming the Silent Realm trial, Link receives the Claw Shots as a pair. This pair is found separately and reunited here in Twilight Princess. One on the surface, the one we found back in Lakebed Temple, and the dungeon item here, the one found in the city in the sky. But back to Skyward Sword, their presence here as a gift to the chosen hero shows that their existence also predates Hyrule and possibly Skyloft, as they were left by Hylia herself. Though it's unclear if these are the exact same claw shots in these games, it could be that these were simply common, useful tools during the era of the surface, as a claw shot is needed to operate the sky cannon, as well as claw shot targets being present all around both the city in the sky and the surface of Lanayru Desert. There's also this swirling golden motif that is all over the place in City in the Sky, and this exact design is found in only one other place ever in the series, as near as I can tell, that being aboard the Sand Ship, which was built by the ancient robots, greatly predating Skyloft and the Kingdom of Hyrule. Admittedly, these may be pretty loose ties, but before we dismiss it entirely, it's worth a mention that these games are pretty deliberate with their symbolism and iconography, and this symbol is present in both regions where we get claw shots. Both Skyward Sword and Minish Cap also feature the Gust Bellows and Gust Jar items, which are pretty much identical in both design and utility. And the Gust Bellows is found in Lanayru Desert, whereas the Gust Jar was a relic of the Wind Tribe. Meanwhile, the Palace of the Winds and the Wind Tribe's homes all feature a great deal of swirling patterns and motifs in their architecture, including these swirling patterns that are a little more squared off. Not unlike these swirling patterns here in City in the Sky. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the Uka are the Wind Tribe. In fact, they are more likely two separate sky-dwelling tribes, since the Uka kept in communication with the royal family, while the Wind Tribe actually forbade surface dwellers from entering their home. And the Wind Tribe is far more focused on magic, while the Uka seems more technologically reliant. But I am saying that their connections both predate Hyrule and are likely a stronger candidate for at least being connected than the Skyloftians are. Both are ancient races who lived on the surface prior to the foundation of Hyrule, who chose to ascend up to and live in the sky. The music here follows Twilight Princess's minimalist approach to dungeon music, but with an ethereal twist. This track pretty perfectly represents what this dungeon is about. The instrumentation wonderfully evokes the sound of magic being in the winds, with what sounds like bird calls peppered in. Of Of course, this place is the home of the bizarre Uka, these bird-bodied sky beings, so this makes sense. It's hard to articulate exactly what it is about this track that fits so perfectly here, aside from the fact that it just carries that sense of height and scale with it incredibly well, and the unorthodox instrumentation only aids its ethereal and strange tone. There's a lot of wonderful ambient music in this game, but this might be one of the best for simply how well it fits the dungeon that it's meant to represent. That said, it's also a tad on the repetitive side, and considering this is the longest dungeon in the game, that means there's a real chance that you'll get pretty tired of the track by the end of it. But that may just be the inevitable fate of any song when listened to on repeat for long enough, no matter how good a track it is. Alright, let's talk about the progression. We'll enter the dungeon by landing in this pool of water at the southernmost section of the city after being launched by the Sky Cannon. Uku will land here with you and welcome you to her hometown, but then we see that dragon Argarok fly by. Another Uka, a shopkeeper, comes out and these two chat before bringing us up to speed. Apparently this dragon has been raging around the city, and so they retreat to the shop just up the walkway here. She immediately rejoins you when you talk to her again though, so I don't really see what the point of that was, but hey, if you need to stock up on supplies, you can do so here at the shop. Alright, not much to do here aside from grabbing these optional chests, so we can head across the bridge to the north towards the first pod, the city center. There's a gem switch above the door here that you can shoot to unlock it. A quick side note, there's very strong gusts of wind during some of these outdoor sections, so you can always slip on your iron boots to prevent yourself from getting swept around. Alright, there's a short hallway here with some gaps in the floor, so you'll want to use one of these Uka to chicken glide across the room and head through the next door. This brings us to what is probably the closest thing this dungeon has to a central room. This large room introduces us to a new enemy, a Helmosaurus, which is basically just a larger version of these Helmosaurs that we've been fighting. From this central room we have 3 doors, each leading towards a separate pod of the city, so a bit of process of elimination is required here. To the north is where we'll head towards the boss fight, but we can't reach there yet, so it's basically a dead end for now. The 2 side doors also appear at first to be dead ends as well, as there's these massive gaps that we can't cross. So instead we'll want to head out to the side of this walkway on the east side and out this window ledge on the west side. On either end we can use the spinner to extend the bridges connecting the 2 side pods to the central one. That said, you'll find that the door to the eastern pod is locked, so we'll need to nab this key from this small room in the western pod first. We can head back and Argarok will actually destroy the western bridge that we just extended. Not cool, dude. We can head back to the eastern pod, spending that key, and we'll emerge in this room with these massive fans. There's a cleverly hidden gem switch to shut off one of these fans, but for the other 2 we'll need to use the iron boots and claw shot to get past them. Make sure to duck into this side room, which leads to this enclosed section of a much larger room, we'll be back there soon, and open this chest to get the dungeon map. Heading through the next door takes us into this hallway with several keys. We'll need to avoid the updrafts in here and obstacle course our way to the next door. There's a short combat challenge here as well, where we'll need to face off against a pair of Dino foes. Put your hidden skills to good use and they'll go down, which unlocks this gated off alcove in here. I guess they were keeping these Uka as prisoners? We can hook shot up, pull this switch down to activate this updraft, and then use one of these Uka to glide across the room and to the next door on the opposite ledge. There's another series of hallways with updrafts that we'll need to use with these Uka, and eventually we'll make it to this large vertical room. There's some various baddies around the room like Keese and Dekubabas, but in short, we'll want to use an Uka once again to glide around the room and make our way to the very bottom where we'll find the next door. The next room has a massive fan, which we can shut off by pulling down this switch, allowing us to lower ourselves down into the room below. This actually takes us to the mid-boss fight, pitting us against an aerial foes. These guys are essentially just Lizalfos with wings, and it carries on with having mid-bosses that become common enemies later, which isn't my favorite trend, as I prefer it when mid-bosses are unique to the dungeon itself, like Death Sword or Darkhammer was. But it makes for a fun mid-boss nonetheless. We'll need to avoid his attacks and wait for an opportunity when he raises his shield. You'll notice that his shield works as a claw shot target, meaning we can yank him to the ground, opening him up to attack. Seize the moment when he's vulnerable and deal some damage. He'll mix up his attacks and zoom around the room to throw us off, but keep at him with this tactic and he'll go down. His defeat opens this alcove, rewarding us with the dungeon item. It's another claw shot. Yep. I remember the first time playing this game and thinking that this was a glitch or something, but no. Combining this with the claw shot that we already have gives us the double claw shots, which is one of the greatest items in any Zelda game ever. Now we can latch on or raise and lower ourselves with one claw shot while having the second one ready to use, making the item far more versatile. And of course, it's just a blast to use. Alright, we'll need to use those claw shots to get out of this room by maneuvering along the ceiling and through the opening that we entered from. We'll return to this large vertical room, and this time we can use the claw shot points on the wall to Spider-Man our way around the sides of the room. This reminds me a bit of ascending up the central room of Wind Waker's Wind Temple, but done way better. It just feels less tedious since we don't have to land on these platforms before aiming again. We'll want to make our way over to this switch, which we can pull down to open this gate. Lower ourselves down the chain and zip into the alcove where we can head through the next door. This next room has us doing some more Spider-Man-like claw shotting, made even snappier by the fact that we can now target those claw shot points. We'll find the compass here, and through the next door we'll emerge onto a ledge underneath the bridge that we extended earlier on, the one that didn't get destroyed. We can use the claw shots to cling to this grating on the bridge's underside to make our way across here. Just watch out for the Dekubabas, and we'll find ourselves back in the central room. That pretty much completes everything we need to do in the eastern pod. We still have no boss key, nor do we have the means to even reach the northern pod, so we'll need to return to the western side of the dungeon next. Earlier, Argarok destroyed this bridge, but now that we have the double claw shots, we can use these P-hats to cross the gap and reach the door. We already visited this room earlier to get that first key, but this time there is more that we can do here. In fact, there is a lengthy, winding section of hallways and rooms here that we have to navigate both horizontally and vertically using the claw shots. They sprinkle in a handful of enemies here to keep things interesting, but just navigating this section is almost a puzzle in itself as we zip around here, and because of the way these rooms are laid out, the map is almost no help, but that's part of the fun and the challenge here. We'll find ourselves in this northwesternmost room where we'll have to battle this big Baba and Deku-like, just like the one that we faced way back in the Forest Temple. Once that's dealt with, we can make our way up and around the room here. There's an alcove with an optional chest in here containing a piece of heart, and when we make it to the top of the room, we'll drop onto this walkway where we'll face another Dinalfos. We'll next emerge onto these courtyards on the roof of the pod. We can use the claw shots to hang on these P-hats and make our way around these sections and over these walls. You can take a slight detour to this small isolated pod with this lone tree where you'll find a Poe and a stamp if you'd like. But otherwise, we'll want to make our way over to this door on the eastern side of the room. We'll find ourselves on this upper balcony overlooking the gap between the western and central pods. You can take yet another slight detour to this second balcony and head through the door to nab this piece of heart. And then we'll cross over to the balcony of the central pod. we'll find ourselves at this top courtyard here with this large tower in the middle. There's a door we can use to head inside the tower, but there's not much to do in here just yet. Instead, we'll need to climb up to this ledge and tightrope walk around these different platforms. Optionally, we can fight another Poe as well as grab yet another stamp, but our main objective will be to climb to the second floor door of this central tower. Inside here, we'll battle another Helmosaurus, and we'll find this chest containing the boss key. Great. There's a switch to pull down, which disables the fan that's blowing in the room below. So let's head down there, then lower ourselves down into the room below, which is actually the central room from earlier on. Don't drop straight down though, because we'll need to reach this switch on the ceiling, which actually turns on the fan built into the northern wall. This causes these propellers to turn, giving us a way to finally reach that northern pod using the claw shots. We're almost there. We just need to ascend up this final pod. But first, there's a quick battle with a pair of aerial foes. They can be defeated by using the same tactic as before, yank them down by the shield, and deal some damage once they're grounded. Alright, while hanging on this first propeller, we can activate this gem switch to get these moving, and make our way up this large vertical room, at the top of which we'll finally reach the boss door. We'll emerge onto this balcony near the top of the pod, but the walkway up to the roof has crumbled away, so instead we'll need to bypass it with the claw shots and climb up. At the top of the pod circles the boss, who wastes no time in initiating the battle. This is Argarok, and I love him. Known as the Twilight Dragon, Argarok has a pretty intimidating and, to put it plainly, just an awesome design. He maintains that impressive sense of scale that this game's boss battles have embraced. Besides, dragons are always fun, and having this massive flying beast be the bane of this floating metropolis really makes a lot of sense. There's not many other baddies that could make their way up here. Maybe I'm biased though, because I just think this heavily armored dragon just looks freaking cool. As a side note about the music here, Argarok shares his boss battle theme with Morpheal. While it could be a case of recycling or laziness even, considering the scope of this game's score, in which every other boss has gotten their own unique song, I think it may have been intentional. These are the two bosses in the game in which we need to use the claw shots. The method for defeating them is also very similar. It makes sense to thematically tie them together, in my opinion. I feel like there's no harm done there. As I mentioned in the Lakebed Temple video, I really think this is a good piece of boss battle music. It's thrilling and dramatic, and just fits the bill. The first phase of this battle will see us cling to these grated towers, and then use the claw shot to grab his tail. While hanging off of him, use the extra weight of the iron boots to weigh him down, effectively smashing him into the ground. This will knock off pieces of his armor. Repeat this until we've fully disassembled that protective shell and exposed his weak point on his back. This brings us to the second phase of the battle. He'll fly into the air and try to breathe fire at you. Use the double claw shots to zip between these pea-hats and avoid getting singed. You'll need to be as quick as possible to get behind him and then claw shot onto his back. Just like with Morpheal, we'll have a chance to strike at that weak point and deal some damage while clinging on to his back. It's exhilarating, it's tense, it's moody, and it's just frankly awesome. All that said, Argarok is one of the easier bosses in the game. It's very much about spectacle here, more so than challenge, but I think I'm okay with that. This has been the most difficult dungeon so far in the game, and so having a boss that's more like a bombastic, triumphant celebration of that makes some sense to me. I still wish it were a bit more difficult, but I'm not sure how I would implement any additional challenge without overhauling the way he's fought. And considering how different that method of defeating him is from other bosses, I'll take the win here. this certainly doesn't fall prey to the same issues that Armagoma did. It really feels like that dungeon item is implemented thoughtfully and in a fun way here, essentially being an extension of the way we used the dungeon item in the dungeon itself. And of course, this fight steers away from giant eyeballs, which is always a win in my books. And hey, didn't I say before how it would be cool to use the dungeon item to disassemble Armagoma's exoskeleton in order to expose her weak spot? Well, that's exactly what we got to do here, and I think it's great. It feels like we're problem solving at the same time as doing a battle, and I always enjoy when bosses have a bit of a puzzle element involved. Argarok also feels more involved and aggressive in the battle. He's constantly trying to breathe fire at you, take big swoops at you, and he even wises up to your attack patterns and will try to breathe fire in front of you while hookshotting between these P-hats, rather than Armagoma, who just kinda crawled around on the ceiling a bunch. So with enough persistence, Argarok will go down, we'll get our heart container, and that final mirror fragment will be ours. So that's the dungeon. City in the Sky is a long dungeon. Maybe too long. Some of these obstacle courses overstay their welcome a bit, and there are some rooms that don't feel quite so purposeful. In a way, many of Twilight Princess's issues on a larger scale are sort of distilled in this dungeon. Lengthy sections that feel like somewhat meaningless padding, long strings of linearity, and huge areas that give the illusion of openness but are actually quite rigid in their progression. But just like the game as a larger whole, those issues are overshadowed by some truly brilliant design choices. Yes, there are long sections that maybe do overstay their welcome a bit, but those sections taken on their own merits are unique, refined, and fun. The floor plan here is massive, once again spanning 8 floors, but each of those sections are memorable and all shine with sparks of genius. And of course, the double claw shots are my absolute favorite dungeon item in any Zelda game, and having a dungeon built around the incredible mobility options that these items allow is just awesome. I can appreciate the fusion of design elements that they were trying to implement here, and I think overall it works to the dungeon's benefit. So, is it a perfect dungeon? No. They could have trimmed the fat here, so to speak, and refined the dungeon down to something that was maybe a little more comprehensive and concise. It's easy to lose track of what's what with how much they've packed into this place. For example, there are too many optional chests. I'm the sort who only considers a dungeon complete when all the treasure chests have been opened, and most of these are completely pointless item pickups or petty cash. The linear, winding nature of the dungeon can make backtracking a pain as well, and if you say missed an optional chest that you want to go back for, then that can tack on a great deal of extra playtime simply because of how this place is laid out. And just like with Snow Peak, I feel once again like the 2 pieces of heart that are in this dungeon are not spaced out well enough. One is found literally in the next room from the other, and I feel like, considering how many hidden optional chests there are in this dungeon, that they could have easily spread these out better. But beneath all of that, we have a slew of micro challenges and obstacle courses, double claw shot based mobility, awesome baddies, unique architecture that is unlike anything else in the game or even in the series, incredible lore discussion, all topped off with an incredible spectacle of a boss fight against a freaking dragon. So overall, it's not my favorite dungeon in the game, falling somewhere in the middle for me due to how much of a mixed bag it is, but what it does right, it undeniably does very right. In fact, despite any and all complaints that I have with it, the truth is that I always have so much fun completing this dungeon. Thank you so much for watching this video. I just wanted to take a quick second to say thank you to the lovely people who support me on Patreon, as well as my channel members, in particular those who supported at the cheese tier or higher, which includes Tetra, Brenda, Justin, Callie, Finley, Grey Mage, Hylian Historian, Gale, Ethan3G, and Clifford. Thank you so much for the support, you guys, and I will catch you all next time. Bye-bye.